Welcome, people. It's great to have you. We're gonna give it a minute or so before we get started. So glad you're here, and just we'll let people who are still getting in join the room. But thanks for joining. Welcome, people who've just joined. We're going to get started in just probably 30 seconds or so. So glad you're with us, and we'll be starting in just a little bit. Welcome. There's still people joining, but I think we have a lot to cover, so we're going to get started. My name is Stephen Rothstein, and I'm the Managing Director of the Ceres Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets, and we are thrilled that you're all with us today. Let me start with a few housekeeping items. First, to thank our co-sponsor, US SIF, that we value their support on this and working with them on so many other issues. There's clearly a lot going on. So today's discussion, alphabet soup, a comparison of ISSB's climate exposure draft and the SEC proposed rule will give a lot of information. We have a lot of amazing speakers, so I want to get to those. Quickly, this is being recorded, so you're aware. All of you today will get a copy of this, and the slides will be shown for more information. That we very much want to make this interactive. So there are already a few questions in Q&A, so want to continue. We won't get to them right away, but want to encourage you to do that. Most of you know we've had a chance to work with Ceres before, but Ceres, a nonprofit's been around for over 30 years, working with investors, companies, policymakers, regulators. And this gives a quick overview of the background of the company network, working with some of the leading companies, investors that collectively reflect over $60 trillion of assets, the policy network, and the accelerator as part of that. If we can go to the next slide. And as I say, we have amazing speakers, and I'm just going to today, right now, introduce all of them, and then we'll go to them. But just really briefly, Mindy is the CEO and president of Ceres. Again, if I read her list of awards, that alone would take us the hour. But there is probably no one who's had a bigger impact on this field that Mindy has, both here at Ceres and before her work here. Janine is in Europe, and so she is joining us via remarks that she taped just a few days ago. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Value Reporting Foundation, and she's worked to advance progress on these key issues. She's also serves as a special advisor to the International Sustainability Standards Board, and obviously had been the prior CEO of SASB as that was merging into that. And then we have two senior colleagues from the team there. Katie Schmidt-Hewlett, she's worked for VRF, the Value Reporting Foundation, formerly SASB, since its inception, and is now the Director of Investor Relations and the market leader the senior market co-leader in APAC, and really has been an amazing leader in this area. And Brian is the Chief Technical Officer of SASB and VRF. And in his role, he leads the SASB technical staff's research analysts and market engagement on these key issues. So there's probably no two people who know the details of these, except for the last speaker, who's Julie Gordy. She's a senior vice president for sustainable investing at Impact Investment. She has, again, a long list of incredible achievements. She also previously served on the Ceres board, but is a thought leader in every sense of the word. So we're going to jump right in. I'm going to have first with Mindy. Again, encourage you to put questions. We'll get to them later. So with that, I'll turn this over to Mindy Luber, the CEO of Ceres. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. And I will be brief, but let me welcome you. I know that if I could see every one of the faces in the little boxes we get to visit with each other in, many of you have been folks who we've been worked with for decades. And we've been at this for 2 decades, if not 2.5 decades. I'm not sure if that says we're slow or we're effective and persistent. And I certainly want to think it is the latter. We are making progress in this space. It has taken some time, but that's because we had to change literally the vernacular and the thinking of financial markets. But together we've done that. We're making good progress globally. We're making good progress on voluntary standards and on mandatory standards. And I want to thank all of you for your persistence. This is important work. It's worth the decades of effort, and we've just got to keep at it until we land this plane, or whatever analogies we want to use. I mean, I don't need to tell you that disclosure is just a defining issue, not only for Ceres, but all of us as we think about moving forward. At Ceres, we co-founded GRI literally 25 years ago. It's hard to even think that long back. One of the first global frameworks for sustainability reporting, but clearly a framework that wants to be integrated with all the work we're doing now. And we and so many, hundreds of our investor members were pioneers with so many of you in driving recognition of climate risks as a financial material risk. And together with all of you and our investor partners, we first called for mandatory disclosure of climate risk 15 years ago. We got a modest piece of guidance, and we've been advocating for it ever since. And doing so is worth all of our time. We fundamentally, I know you believe that markets work, but only work when there's useful information. And despite the compelling need, and despite the formidable work that each of you have done, we've made clear and specific progress, yet the asymmetry that we and our investor partners see in the market around climate risk continues and needs to be fixed. So now, more than ever, there is a clear need for consistent and comparable information that we can all use, companies, investors, the civil society, to make informed financial decisions on where we shop and where we invest and what we do. Mandatory climate disclosure is a natural and an important evolution, not only because of the critical climate issues facing us, but because it's clearly within the mandates of financial entities and regulators like the IFRS, the SEC, and others around the world to address financial risk. There's also room, and as we're talking about today, for extraordinarily consistent and profound voluntary standards on reporting. We know that we shouldn't even have to make the case anymore that the market wants this information. We were working with, and a number of our investors, where we organized 733 institutional investors from around the globe with more than $52 trillion in assets under management, calling for governments to step up to create an ambitious program for action on climate risk, including mandatory standards and consistency as much as we could get globally. Recently, our net zero asset managers initiative announced new signatories with $61 trillion in assets under management who have made net zero commitments in managing their portfolios. They can only do this if companies provide the marketplace with the right, consistent, clear, useful information. We simply cannot get there without that. The result will be a financial and an economic playing field where the risks companies face and the opportunities they have are clear and are valuable and are used by investors around the globe. We've just completed our filing with the SEC on the mandatory climate disclosure proposal. Our comments are available on the website. We have worked with hundreds of companies and investors. We think the 507-page, I think it's single, and we're eager to make sure others support it, although the comment period did close this past Friday. But as that's moving forward, today we're looking at global implications, and we are thrilled to be discussing with our partners of the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, and about their recent climate exposure draft, an incredibly important piece of work. It is a great step in their initiative to establish comprehensive global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards. We see extraordinary similarities between this and the SEC's proposal, including the draft's use of TCFD guidance and greenhouse gas protocol as a basis for the standards. We hope everyone on this webinar today, after we hear from our colleagues, will submit a response to the climate exposure draft. We certainly will submit comments and look forward to seeing yours as well. We are extremely supportive of the direction of this draft that we'll be talking through. We might have a specific tweak here or there, but it is a profoundly important and well thought through document. And one key that we all remember, there are no companies at the level we're all working with or investors that stop at the borders of the United States or North America. Markets work better when there's cross-border jurisdictions that are coordinated. And this guidance, this draft, helps us get there. So I'm delighted to host this discussion and to be joined by our colleagues, Janine Gilliard, who is just a wonderful thought leader, and her colleagues from ISSB. I'm delighted to have Julie Gordy back, who has been with us on so many webinars, but we've got the real experts who we're all waiting to hear from. So back to you, Stephen, to turn it over to the real experts.
Thank you. Well, we're going from strength to strength, from Mindy's comments to Janine's to give the VRF perspective. So let's hear Janine's comments.
This is a momentous moment for sustainability. Hello, I want to thank Ceres for co-hosting this webinar and thank all of you for joining us today. This is a momentous moment for sustainability disclosure. Around the world, important initiatives are developing to set mandatory disclosure standards to deliver a global baseline of sustainability disclosure for the capital markets. There are 3 open public consultations. The first from the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB. The second from IFRAG, the body which advises the European Commission on financial reporting. And the third from the US Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC. If you hear one message from all of us speaking on this webinar today, I hope that message is this. It has never been more important for stakeholders, such as yourselves, to engage in the development of the sustainability disclosure landscape. This is our once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get it right. And why does this matter? Because sustainability disclosure isn't just about disclosure. It's about enhancing business and investor decision-making, improving business and sustainability performance, and about enabling investors to manage risk more effectively. We envision a world where companies benchmark their sustainability performance and compete to improve it, just as companies compete and benchmark financial performance today. And comparable and consistent and reliable sustainability information is key to realizing that vision. So during today's webinar, we're going to focus on the ISSB's climate exposure draft and the SEC's proposed climate rule. These two initiatives have substantial alignment, as you'll hear from our speakers. And it's important. Why is that alignment important? It's important that the final ISSB climate disclosure standard and the final US SEC rule are as consistent as possible. This will minimize the reporting burden for multinational companies, and it will increase the utility of the information for global investors. But we can't get there unless businesses and investors make their voices heard via these consultations. So please respond to both the ISSB and the US SEC and let them know whether their proposals deliver decision useful disclosure in a way that's cost effective for preparers. And we encourage you to use your responses to all consultations to urge the global regulatory community to work together to prevent regulatory fragmentation. We know that responding to consultations can take time, and it may seem really overwhelming right now because so much is going on. But sometimes a short one-page letter with a list of key points is sufficient to help ensure that regulators and standard setters can gauge market sentiment. And of course, for those of you who have more resources, we very much value your detailed feedback on the technical elements of the proposals. Many of you listening today have advocated for improved sustainability disclosure and for a simplified sustainability disclosure landscape for many, many years. So thank you to all of you for your support and your hard work that has resulted in the really momentous point at which we find ourselves today. Together, with one last push, we can finally deliver a robust and effective disclosure landscape fit for tackling global challenges now and in the future. It's important to make your voice heard in these consultations, so please, so that the resulting system works better for all of us. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Janine. That's very helpful. And again, she's been working this for quite a while, as many folks on this call have. We've already gotten some questions in the Q&A. That's great. I encourage more people to submit them as we go forward. But now I'm going to shift to Katie and Brian, and we're going to put up a slide deck. They're going to go through those. And as I said earlier, but if you just joined, you'll be getting a copy of these later. So there are some hyperlinks on these and other things that you can go through as well. They're also available online. So with that, Katie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. And it's a real honor and a real pleasure to be here in such an esteemed company. We're huge fans of Ceres. I'm a huge fan of Mindy's and Julie's and everyone on the call, Steve. And I'm sure I know many people who are on the line with us today. I am going to start by giving us, if we could move on to the next slide, a quick background on the ISSB, and then we'll hand over to my colleague, Brian Esterly, who will do a deeper dive on the ISSB exposure drafts, which are currently open for comment. So if we move on to the next slide, I just want to give you kind of a brief overview, since IFRS financial accounting standards are not widely used in the US, to give you some background on the IFRS. The IFRS Foundation was created in 2001 to develop globally accepted accountancy standards, and those standards, the IFRS accounting standards, are now mandated in over 140 jurisdictions around the world. It's now a de facto global accounting language, but that wasn't always the case. And there are some parallels here with what's happening in the world of sustainability disclosure. 20 years ago, different jurisdictions had different accounting requirements. So we're delighted that the Value Reporting Foundation is rolling up into the IFRS Foundation at the end of the month, and all of our staff and all of our IP will become part of the IFRS suite of resources. But moving on to the next slide, let's talk about the background here and why the IFRS has established the ISSB. So over the years, the name of this webinar nails it, the alphabet soup of voluntary initiatives were necessary to get the ball rolling here, but they are now meeting a variety of jurisdictional activities. So we find ourselves in a reporting landscape that's characterized by multitudes of voluntary frameworks. Moving on to the next slide, that really has yielded this alphabet soup. And what we find is It's costly and complex for companies to report and for investors to source data from all of these voluntary initiatives. It's difficult for companies and investors to benchmark performance. It limits transparency. It limits the global comparability and consistency of information, which at the end of the day diminishes trust in the data that is produced through these voluntary sustainability reporting standards and frameworks. So moving on to the next slide, it was in response to this market need that the IFRS trustees put forth a consultation to say, maybe we should get into the sustainability accounting standards space or disclosure standards space. They received resounding support for that. And so in November of 2021 at COP26, they announced that they would form the ISSB, their International Sustainability Standards Board, and at the same time announced that they would be consolidating the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, or the CDSB, as well as the Value Reporting Foundation, our people and our resources up into the IFRS to take on the work of the ISSB and gain what they've called a running start on standard setting. Back in November, they also published prototype standards of general reporting requirements and a climate standard that my colleague Brian will talk to you about now that they are in exposure draft form. So a lot happened in November of last year, and we are now seeing the fruits of those efforts. So moving on to the next slide, what will be the remit of ISSB? What will we actually do? So if we could move on to the next slide, the remit of the ISSB is to develop a global baseline for sustainability disclosures and a digital taxonomy to enable electronic tagging of that information. The focus of the ISSB is squarely on meeting the needs of investors and establishing a foundational global baseline for disclosure on sustainability issues that are related to enterprise value. I like to quote Erkki Liikanen, who says, this is not a shallow baseline, this is a very deep global baseline. So bear that in mind. It's also necessary to take on what we call a building blocks approach to facilitate the different reporting to meet the different ambitions and requirements of different jurisdictions around the world who are not all on the same page about how quickly or how much they will mandate disclosure. So establishing the global baseline is the first step, and then enabling different jurisdictions to add different building blocks of disclosure onto that to meet their local jurisdictional needs and the needs of other stakeholders is also what we have in mind when we're talking about this global system and the global baseline that the ISSB is aiming to establish. Moving on to the next slide, hopefully this will give you kind of a visual image, picture of what we mean by that building blocks system. So in the innermost box, we have what companies around the world do without question. Everybody publishes their financial reports, their financial statements based on generally accepted principles, either from the IFRS or in the case of the US, from FASB, US GAAP. And we get standardized data on the financial performance of companies through those standards. The aim of the ISSB, this middle box, is to establish a foundational global baseline for sustainability-related financial disclosures that report on those sustainability issues that are related, again, to enterprise value. Then we have this, what we're hoping to communicate, which is a system that is interoperable and connected with the outer box here, the world of impact, which companies have inarguably had on the environment, on society over time. The middle box takes a look at the impact that companies have, but how that relates back to the financial condition, operating performance, market valuation of companies at the industry level. And if you look closely at this graphic, you'll see that the boundaries between these boxes are perforated, and that is very intentional, because we see things press through that membrane of financial materiality, sometimes rapidly, sometimes over time. So it's quite necessary for us to have a common language to talk about these things as we set standards at ISSB, as the GSSB, the GRI Standard Setting Board, sets standards. And so we're working hard to collaborate with one another as we move forward. Moving on to the next slide, what I hope you take away from this is an image of a rapidly simplifying, a dramatically simplifying disclosure landscape. And it's not necessarily obvious if you're not in this on a day-to-day basis, but we are seeing rationalization and simplification of the reporting landscape. So TCFD recommendations and SASB standards are going through an ISSB due process as part of the climate disclosure standard that Brian will talk more about. SASB standards are also noted as priority materials in the general reporting requirements of the ISSB IFRS S1 general reporting requirements that are open for comment. Then the integrated reporting framework is also undergoing both an IASB and an ISSB due process as we contemplate how to more clearly articulate the connections between information in financial reports and information that is communicated in sustainability standards or via sustainability standards. So with that, I will hand the mic over to my colleague, Brian Esterly, and moving on to the next slide, who will talk about the general reporting, the general requirements exposure draft, and then the climate draft. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Katie. Why don't we jump to the next slide? So once again, I'm Brian Esterly. I'm thrilled to be here, or rather really honored to be here and speaking with all of you. And thank you to Ceres for inviting us to speak on what's taking place out there right now in the landscape. And maybe the best place to start off here is picking up on Katie's previous comments on what the ISSB is focused on, where we are very focused on simplifying the landscape and developing a global baseline for investor-oriented sustainability disclosure standards. And we've been really happy to be able to move quickly forward in that regard. As Katie mentioned, the ISSB was only established, really first announced or committed to by the IFRS Foundation back in November at COP26. The chair and the vice chair, Emmanuel Faber and Sue Lloyd, were appointed in January. And then by March, so just a few months ago, we were already, the ISSB was already able to release the first two exposure drafts, the general requirements exposure draft, as well as the climate exposure draft. So we've been able to do this really because we are looking to simplify the landscape and the consolidation around bringing the Value Reporting Foundation, so both the SASB standards and the IR framework, as well as the staff and the CDSB into the IFRS Foundation to help establish the ISSB and leverage the existing work, leverage the existing resources that have taken place to date, and get off to this running start. Standard setters are not always known to be able to move very quickly, but in this situation, the ISSB is very focused on this running start. And that's why we're happy to have been able to already release these first two exposure drafts and are actively pushing these projects forward. I'll spend a little bit of time on the general requirements and then a bit more on the climate, where I'll make a few comments on the SEC as well. Next slide, please. So the general requirements exposure draft, and again, both of these exposure drafts are out for consultation right now, and that consultation is open for another 5 weeks. So we are very strongly encouraging stakeholders to provide comment letters before the consultation period closes. The general requirements exposure draft, it's an overarching proposed standard in that it requires companies to provide material information on all significant sustainability risks and opportunities necessary for investors to assess enterprise value. I will also comment on how the SASB standards play a really important role to be able to fulfill the general requirements. And to do that, why don't we move to the next slide? This is what I mean by the general requirements as a broad overarching standard, where in reality, how those requirements would be fulfilled are other standards produced by the ISSB, the climate standard for climate related issues to begin with. But because sustainability is much broader than climate, the general requirements is pointing directly to the SASB standards, the CDSB framework, as materials to help prepare, implement the standard. This is really important, I think, for preparers, for investors to understand, as it's a continuity for the SASB standards and the CDSB framework. In other words, and these messages have been clearly disseminated by the ISSB, preparers and investors that are using the SASB standards should continue to do so. And if a preparer is not currently using the SASB standards, implementing them will do nothing but put them in a better position to comply with this general requirement standard further down the road. A lot more we could get into here, but I would love to use some time to go into more on the climate exposure draft specifically. So next slide, please. The climate exposure draft is really the best way to think about it is that it incorporates the TCFD recommendations and it incorporates the SASB industry-based standards. Again, it's largely structured around TCFD from the perspective of the overarching structure on governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And then when we get into thinking about climate-related risks and opportunities, we're also using the structure around physical risks, around transition risks, around climate-related opportunities. This is maybe my first comment around the SEC is this is a major positive in my view and around the consistency with the SEC proposed rule, because the SEC has taken a very, very similar position in terms of structuring the proposed rule off of the TCFD structure and the TCFD recommendations. Next slide, please. This is one way to think about it, where really the ISSB climate exposure draft is bringing together the TCFD recommendations. It has fully incorporated the TCFD recommendations, and in some areas further refined or further built out the TCFD recommendations. And then it brings in the SASB industry standards. What I mean by that is when we look across the full range of the SASB's 77 industry standards, all of the disclosure topics and metrics, or really disclosure requirements that are related to climate have been directly incorporated into the climate exposure draft with only 2 areas of difference. One, further improvements around improving the international applicability of some specific metrics. And then secondly, in the financial sector, proposed improvements around financed or facilitated emissions for asset managers or insurance companies, investment banks, and so forth. So in a nutshell, if you take nothing away from this, on the climate exposure draft, other than how it's the result of putting together TCFD and the SASB standards, then I think that's a really useful place to start. A couple more comments on the SEC proposed rule. As has been commented earlier, an enormous amount of consistency between the climate exposure draft and the SEC proposed rule. I mentioned the aspect around being structured around the TCFD recommendations, which is probably the most important place to start, as it kind of guides the structure as well as specific disclosure requirements. There are some areas of difference, and I'll comment on 2 of those that I think are worth noting. One is the SEC proposed rule goes into some disclosure requirements within the scope of financial statements or footnotes to financial statements. The ISSB climate exposure draft does not do that, and that's largely because that's out of the remit of the ISSB. We do, however, in the exposure draft comment or really establish the requirement on connectivity and consistency and other disclosure requirements to help really establish this connectivity between climate disclosures and financial statements and footnotes to financial statements. So while the SEC is able to go a bit farther than the ISSB because of its remit, the ISSB's position does not really contradict in any way. And if anything, it supports and even explicitly requires the need for consistency between financial statements and sustainability disclosures. One other area that I'll mention that's a key difference is around how the ISSB, as I mentioned earlier, has incorporated the SASB industry-specific requirements. The SEC has not gone that far. There are some ways where they're opening the door to that, or even pointing to considering pointing to the ISSB exposure draft. So some very positive signals there. but this is a very important aspect from our perspective on establishing a meaningful global baseline to continue to include the industry-based disclosure requirements, and really in many situations for many preparers and many types of climate risks and opportunities, the need to have that industry lens. Next slide, please. Just very briefly, the ISSB and staff has been out very actively talking with the market and educating the market on the exposure drafts. Certainly been getting a lot of input and encouraging responses to this consultation. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this slide just has a number of the key themes that we're thinking about and we're hearing from the market. So we're already actively thinking about what needs to be redeliberated by the board to have an effective and efficient finalization process further out once the consultation period closes. We are already looking to have the very first ISSB a board meeting and really a public standard setting meeting in July, in less than a month now, where some of these issues will be discussed to set the stage for what we hope is efficiently finalizing the standard further out, while we're continuing to engage with the SEC and continuing to engage with FRAG in striving to establish this global baseline as effectively as possible. Next slide, please. Again, just very much a call to action here. It's a critical time to really set the stage for the future of sustainability disclosures. So please, if you haven't already, we very strongly encourage responses, not just to the SEC. Their comment period closed on Friday, but people can still send in comments. But then to the ISSB, our comment period closes on July 29th, as well as the FRAG's ongoing consultation. Next slide, which some of the dates are here as well. And again, just can't emphasize enough how important these ongoing consultations are, hearing from investors, hearing from companies, and really another important, to Janine's earlier comment, even if a great deal of technical input can be provided, even just from the ISSB's perspective, the need and the importance for this global baseline that the ISSB is striving to establish. Next slide. And I think very last slide for me, just a brief FYI on future work of the ISSB. Later this year, we'll be doing another consultation to help form kind of priorities and future projects further out. So no action needed now, but just stay tuned on. There's a lot of thinking and planning take place to really, again, move forward as quickly as possible with bringing in the SASB standards, looking to other resources and work, an MOU that we've signed with GRI and others to help drive forward this global baseline for investor-oriented sustainability disclosure standards. And if you jump to the next slide, just some contact information, and that's all from me. So I would love to just pass it back over to Stephen at this point.
Great, thank you, Katie and Brian. That's a font of lots of amazing information. And there are already a bunch of questions that I have from it and from our colleagues who are listening in. But before we get to those, I want to turn over to Julie. When you think about the movement in this industry, there is no group more important than the voice of the investors. And Julie and her team and her colleagues at Impacts have been leading on this before even literally the words ESG were in the vocabulary. So Julie, we appreciate all your leadership, and turn over to you for some immediate thoughts and reflections. Julie.
Thank you, Stephen. It's always nice to be reminded how old I am. But with age comes wisdom, right? So hopefully I have some. Thank you. It's really great to be in this August company, and you don't have to worry about that. I was just being me. Sorry, saying something funny. It's really crucial for financial authorities like the IFRS to do this work. I can't tell you how important it is. The voluntary frameworks that we have been really helpful in getting companies to provide this financially useful information. Like any voluntary framework, the result is partial and often inconsistent reporting. Only about 60% of the Russell 1000 reports on emissions, and that's mostly scope 1 and 2. The ratio is higher for developed market large cap companies elsewhere, but nowhere is it 100%. In small cap companies, it's very rare. And very few companies report on scope 3, yet scope 3 emissions are often more than 2/3 of the emissions for a given company. So we need more information. It's clear that the information is already financially useful. Financial markets are already pricing transition risk. So this is something that we definitely need more of. I've been keeping a database of studies that link various aspects of sustainability to financial outcomes for a long time. I have almost 1,000 studies in it right now, and it's really clear that financial markets are seeing climate as a material factor in company performance, both innovation, in terms of innovation, in terms of vulnerability to various types of risk, in terms of emissions, in terms of, net zero targets, things like that. So it's already material on financial markets, but it is still partial, and we could use a lot more information than we have. We could lose 10% of global GDP by 2050, according to Swiss Re, if we don't address climate change effectively. And that will definitely impact financial markets. Physical risk is a particular need, so it's really good to see that in the draft. It's great that you mentioned both, or that you really name and require reporting on both chronic and acute physical risks. 2 years ago, we wrote to all but one of the companies in the S&P 500 about physical risk, and we engaged with over 80 of them and found three that had really thought through their exposures to physical risk and had plans to mitigate or adapt to those risks. The S&P Global estimates that nearly 2/3 of companies have assets that are at significant risk to the physical impacts of climate change, but right now reporting is vanishingly rare on that. So kudos, ISSB, on putting that in the draft. We expect this area to evolve. The exposure draft requires reporting on both transition and physical risks, but they're both really protean. And the actual risks depend on a great many things, from international, national, and local regulatory regimes to the temperature pathway we're actually on. The risk that any company faces under a 1.5 C pathway is really dramatically different than what it faces under a 3C pathway. And it may be in the future we need more guidance on what pathways to choose in terms of reporting. One other possible future piece of guidance, again, kudos to ISSB for including reporting on both short, medium, and long-term impacts. But you look up a definition of long-term and you find that the World Bank calls it anything that happens more than a year from the date of record. So the long-term is not 1 year when it comes to climate change, right? So we may need guidance saying long-term should include at least through mid-century. Another choice, finally, that I hope comes out more fully in the comment process is the idea of enterprise value. It's logical that ISSB chose that as a place to start, report on what these risks and opportunities mean to your enterprise value. But a lot of what's happening with climate change is in the nature of systemic risk. So it's going to enhance the enterprise value for an oil company to keep producing oil, but it's going to hurt, it's going to hurt everybody else's financial performance and economic performance if they do that. So if the reporting is confined to the enterprise, we are missing a lot of the equation that we need to solve with climate change. ISSB may not be the right framework for all of that, and it's good that we have NGFS out there, National Network for Greening the Financial System, out there addressing those systemic risks as well. But it would be interesting to see how this evolves. Thank you so much, ISSB, for putting in this hard work and smart work to create the first step on a future where climate reporting is routine, expected, and priced on financial markets. Thanks.
Julie, thank you. Thank you for that wisdom. We really appreciate it. So we are literally, excuse the pun, but flooded with questions. So we're going to jump right in, and I'll start with Katie and Brian. I'll leave it to you how you want to answer who. But the first thing is the question of enterprise value. Can you define that a little more? One person asked a question about that.
Sure, I can take that. Thanks for the question, Stephen, or whoever submitted that question. I'll comment on this in two different ways. One more of the formal kind of finance definition of it, and then a second way, just a little bit more context around it. So first, the definition of it. really think about equity, the value of equity plus the value of debt. So market capitalization of a company plus the value of net debt. So think about it in terms of the value in which investors or the capital markets are assigning to a company. That's enterprise value. This is really important though, and we're going through very much of an educational journey with a lot of stakeholders that are coming to the table here, particularly financial accountants as an example, where some enterprise value in some regards, not entirely, but in some regards is a bit of a new or different concept for aspects of corporate reporting or aspects of financial accounting, where traditionally the focus is on financial statements, so financial position, operating performance, etc., and looking at that through the lens of financial statements. That is then related to, but different than really the broader concept of enterprise value. So we're extremely focused on the concept of enterprise value because, I'll use an example, if a certain risk has not yet manifested or is not yet showing up in the financial statements, but it's clearly a risk that's material to the company, that investors are thinking about, the company is managing. There's important information. There's important, standardized, comparable information that investors need to assess that risk, to then take a view on enterprise value, kind of beyond what's captured in financial statements. So maybe more than what the individual was asking, but I think that's why this is really important. It's a broader concept than sticking with the financial statements exclusively.
Great. That's very helpful. Let's shift to scope 3. There is a lot of alignment in many areas. One of the areas was a little bit of a difference between the SEC and ISSB's draft of scope 3. Do you want to talk about your perspective of why you've put in scope 3 as you did? I'm happy to follow up, or we'll invite Julie to add as well, but either Katie or Brian, about how is scope 3 addressed in your drafts?
Yes, definitely. So this is where I'll start off here, but then Katie, certainly feel free to jump in, and Stephen or Julie would love any of your comments as well. We do have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 as disclosure requirements within the climate exposure draft. Again, largely in the spirit of incorporating TCFD recommendations. So that's important from our perspective. Maybe one comment first is that really in a implementing the climate exposure draft, what we're saying is that a preparer needs to go through a materiality process to determine the right disclosures to provide. So I think that can be complex, and preparers shouldn't jump to too quick a conclusions when it comes to scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. But I think broadly speaking, we're well aware and need to keep learning more and have a lot of visibility into all of the number of challenges that come with scope 3. There's so many different pieces that flow into it, and there are a number of data challenges that flow into it. And yet it remains where the majority of emissions are associated when we look across the market. So it still can say a lot about the risk or opportunities at hand for any one preparer. I think that then links nicely with the importance of how the ISSB has included the SASB industry-based requirements, because so many of those industry-based requirements are then directly connected to scope 3. So an example might be an automobiles company and an expectation that scope 3 was unsurprisingly very important for an automobiles manufacturer, but there's another level of granularity and useful or comparable data around fleet fuel economy, around electric vehicle or hybrid kind of strategy, capital expenditures, sales, et cetera, et cetera. So that scope 3 disclosure requirement is meant to link in very nicely with the more specific kind of industry-based level of information that we think can provide investors with more of this kind of comprehensive set of information to inform enterprise value. I think it's something is missing without one or without one or the other. So just a few comments from me, but would be happy to hear others chime in here as well.
Julie or Katie, do you want to add anything? Julie, you're on mute.
Was going to be the day that I wasn't that person. Sorry. So much for good intentions. The SEC has taken a different approach to scope 3, and I think it's going to probably for logical reasons. That is, it's afraid it's going to get sued, which will happen. It's almost a guarantee at this point. It's tough. Scope 3 requires companies to do a whole lot more work than they need to do in order to do scope 1 and scope 2. But it is also essential. As you pointed out, as I pointed out, it's, you know, authorities other than us have pointed out the majority of emissions are scope 3 emissions. A lot of people feel like we'll capture a lot of that because there is a lot of double counting if we include scope 3. But frankly, there is double counting between scope 1 and scope 2 also. Like if I own a local restaurant, you know, my scope 2 emissions would be my utilities scope 1 emissions. So, you know, there's already double counting in the system. What it does is it gives you the opportunity as a company or as an investor to know where to focus your attention in reducing emissions, knowing where they come from. So congratulations on including all of scope 3. I think that was really important and not, I mean, I realize that the standard for all of this is materiality, but the SEC made a much bigger deal of saying this is the only material scope 3 emissions need to be reported.
Great. I'm going to move on to 2 other questions, and Katie, direct these to you if possible. And you alluded to this earlier on your chart, but there was an additional question in the Q&A of the relationship with GRI under this new system. How will that work? And will the quote unquote SASB standards go away, or what will be, I think you used the word due process, and in that, so maybe you can outline that, both of those.
Sure, thanks for both of those questions. And Brian, feel free to add on here with more technical details of my answers. But the relationship with GRI basically outlines how we will collaborate with one another. So there will be an ISSB member on the GSSB advisory board, and there will be a GSSB member on the ISSB advisory board to essentially help us with horizon scanning at ISSB to look for issues that may not currently be in ISSB standards or IFRS sustainability disclosure standards, to be precise, but that ought to be, you know, something that we consider as the pipeline of standard setting gets added to over time. When it comes to, sorry, can you repeat the second question? The will the SASB standards go away? Sorry.
And the due,
Yeah,
I think you use the word due process.
Right, right. So you'll note that in the climate disclosure draft, the SASB standards are part of that exposure draft. They are in Appendix B, and those are thus in their improved state, including facilitated and financed emissions, among other improvements like internationalizing some of the metrics. Those are going through an ISSB due process today. The rest of SASB standards have yet to go through an ISSB due process and are therefore, you can think of them as implementation guidance in IFRS S1 or the general reporting requirements. And it's necessary for all of those standards to be vetted by the markets, you know, in addition to what we've already done at SASB, it needs to now be vetted through ISSB. So when I talked about the simplification of the landscape, that is true. However, it may be a little confusing for people in the near term because SASB standards will continue to live on as a brand, if you will, but rebranded to be part of the IFRS suite of resources as we plan out how the rest of SASB standards go through a due process. Brian, is there anything else that you would want to add to that or correct if I'm mistaken?
No, I think that's right. That's all entirely accurate, Katie. I think that if people on the line today take away one thing, it's that no, absolutely not. The SASB standards are not going away. In fact, they're continuing to be invested in and will continue to evolve and be enhanced now that they are governed by the ISSB. So very important message for investors and preparers to understand that if you're using the SASB standards, keep using them. If you're not using them, start using them. And that will do nothing but put you in a better position to both comply with the general requirements, to comply with the climate exposure draft, and then also given all the connectivity or consistency with the SEC proposed rule, same applies there as well. Just one last comment on the GRI piece is that actually just very timely question, just hot off the press today. You could jump on the IFRS Foundation website and look at news releases. And just today, we published an updated statement on our collaboration with GRI, which runs through about the 7 or 8 different ways in which we are engaging with GRI or what stakeholders should expect. So I won't walk through that now, but if it's there publicly on the website, just an update on our ongoing work with GRI.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that updated information. Another question, again, we'll try to get through as many as we can. It has to do with offsets. Can you talk about how ISSB is proposing to deal with offsets?
Yeah, it's a really good question as well, and one where I think we also see a good amount of consistency with the SEC broadly speaking. Really, I think what's important here is keep in mind is that what we're not necessarily doing is establishing like a net zero standard for example. Now, a lot of aspects of the climate exposure draft are directly related to transition plans, unsurprisingly, in a net zero strategy. So when it comes to offsets, really what we're focused on is how offsets are currently being used or are expected to be used in transition plans, and then arming the investor with insight on the quality, the integrity of offsets, so investors can take a view on both the extent to which offsets are embedded in the transition strategy, as well as the quality of those or types of offsets that have been pursued or are likely to be pursued. That's in the spirit of, it's not so much our position as the neutral standard setter to say what is right and what is wrong, but it's our job to arm the investor with comparable information so they can make their assessments on something like a net zero target or a transition plan. I hope that helps.
Very helpful. So again, we're not getting through all of these. There's another question here, which I'm going to give a little bit of an answer and then turn to Julie for her comments. Said, we'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on some of the SEC letters that push back on the proposed rule, particularly the chamber. Things like it's hard, it's complicated, it's expensive, and here. So let me give a quick update and then again, invite Julie to comment. First is, there are some very thoughtful letters that have already been submitted. They're on the SEC website, or if they're not posted yet, they will be soon. One from a group of law professors, one from a group of former SEC chairs about the, is this in their remit? And it absolutely is. And they go, I'm not a lawyer, so I won't try to summarize, but they go through in a very thoughtful, historical way how this is absolutely in the remit of the SEC of the last 88 years. Second part of it, is this expensive? Well, we did a study, we commissioned a study with ERM and others. Again, it's on our website, or it should be on the SEC's website any day, that there are 3 questions. First is, what are companies spending today? Well, on average, large companies are spending $500,000 on climate reporting today. The important work of the ISSB and the SEC and the others will standardize, hopefully over time bring down that cost, but I don't know. But the second part of that is, what's the cost of not spending that money in terms of the risk, the climate risks, floods and fires? And third is for investors. In this study of the interviews we did, we found that large investors are spending $1.3 million today on this kind of analysis. So these are real costs. Let me turn this to Julie for a quick summary, and then I will wrap it up. Julie?
Just to lean into that last comment that you made, the cost of not doing this stuff is far higher than the cost of doing it. So yeah, it's expensive. It's hard. It's not going to be easy for companies to come up with scope 3, for example. But we didn't have financial reporting at one point in our history. And welcome to 1929. That cost us like 10 years of recession and the deepest depression we've ever had. So not having information is not a good basis to build efficient financial markets on. It's worth it. And if you look at what companies spend now on financial reporting, that's expensive and difficult too, but they have systems to cope with it. And we will develop systems to cope with this as well, as it is just as material as the financial information that is reported by companies. In fact, I would argue that for a lot of companies, climate information. Climate risks are going to be a whole lot more material to their performance and everybody else's than things like inventory or tax liabilities, which are required reporting. So
Great,
that's my
thank you.
comment.
So with that, can Becca, if you can put up the last slide or two, with deep thanks to this distinguished panel. Again, we want to encourage everybody to mark on this calendar before your holiday vacations, July 29th, to submit comments. As our colleagues said much more articulately than I can, they very much want your thoughts. I've just put my email in the chat. You'll all be getting a note in the next few days with a link to this with our email as well. So if you have additional questions, let us know. And last slide, please. And again, with deep thanks to all of you for your time, to Mindy and Janine and Katie and Brian and Julie, plus all the folks behind the scenes at Ceres who've worked on this. So I hope you have a great day, and we hope that you participate in this comment period with ISSB, IFRS. And if there are additional questions on this or on anything with SEC, reach out to us. Thank you again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.